Hello everyone, I'm finally doing the video on the breakdown of the benefits of urban grazing. And I delayed for a little bit because I kept finding new examples from the field to use, and I keep learning a little bit more about this topic. And I was also waiting to hear from more people. You may have noticed that I put out some invitations for you to tell me what you believe urban grazing to be and how exactly it works. Because I think it's important to do some critical thinking on your own prior to being told by someone else what the answer is, so that you have your own idea and then you can use that to decide whether or not you accept the information being provided to you or reject it.
Here's a quick taste of how quickly this can get complicated. Urban grazing. What is it? And why do we need it? Meaning, what went wrong in the first place? How does it work? Does it work? How do we know if it works? And who determines if it works? Meaning, when we're determining success, what evidence are we looking at, and who's providing the evidence? But before analyzing the evidence, we need to have understood what the goals were in the first place. Do we? Do you? And then there are a lot of topics that I personally think people don't even consider, and I call those X factors, and I'll save those for the end.
To do this properly, I'm going to cover many angles of this topic, ranging from what I consider to be very basic, common sense level stuff to the nitty-gritty details of conflicting scientific reports. I'm going to split the basics category into two main branches and go down from there. Obviously, we need to know what urban grazing is and how it works. And since it's being presented to the public as a solution, we need to know what the problem is and what went wrong. These two topics go hand in hand, so I'll keep revisiting each of them for a little bit as we proceed. Although I did read some peer-reviewed papers, and I'm going to include references to those papers, I am mostly going to focus on observation and common sense. Because as a society, I kind of feel like we've drifted away from that, from our own ability to use critical thinking. And now we just read a headline and go with, oh, a scientist said this or that. Problem is, these days science is for sale, and you can find anything on the internet to back up your argument, no matter what your argument is, even if someone else published completely contradictory results. You have to consider the source of the study. You have to consider the source of the information. You have to consider who funded it and who benefits from it. Now, it's fairly likely that I already upset a few viewers with that last line, which is part of what makes tackling a topic like this so challenging. Because whether we're talking about religion or what I used to document, sharks, or this, people don't like having what they've already accepted as fact challenged. We don't like change, especially when something's been indoctrinated into us and then someone comes along and says, guess what? That was all bullshit. Just don't like that. And I can hardly blame you. Unfortunately, as time goes on, you start to realize that's a lot of what we've been taught. And not to give away too much of what's coming up, but I'm already at a disadvantage because I'm sort of playing the part of the bad guy here, because I'm taking what has been presented as a feel-good story and saying it was all a lie. So just stick with me and see if the evidence stacks up. All right, this video is already spiraling out of control. Let's quickly steer back to the first basic of what is urban grazing. Now, perhaps you've seen in your neighborhood or on a walking path or up in the hills somewhere a sign that says goats in your neighborhood, or goats working with your neighborhood, or maybe you've seen the goats themselves up on the hillside. And the sign says that the goats are there for our benefit and that they are either there to fight invasive plants or to fight wildfire potential. Or sometimes they claim both. So what we're doing is introducing animals, usually a herd of animals, usually a herd of a species of animal that really likes to eat, to come in and get rid of plants through consumption of the plants. And that's true. There's no denying that the goats come through and eat plants. But the first sign I ever saw about this claimed that the goats were there specifically to fight invasive plants and to help native plants. So without even watching what the goats were doing, I'm asking myself, how do you guarantee that the goats are eating the bad guys and not the good guys? I understand that expecting immediate perfection is unrealistic. Let me just quickly address some of the counter arguments that I'm sure are brewing in some of your minds. You gotta expect a few native plants to get eaten in the process of getting rid of the invasive plants. Yeah, I'll give you that. You can't expect it to all happen overnight. You got to give it some time. Okay, I'll give you that too. But the little escape hatch by saying that this is a multi-year program allows them to just kind of sneak out the back door without people even realizing that nothing was accomplished. Because now you've got a community that was told, hey, you can expect good results X years from now, and it kind of gets put out of mind. Like, well, okay, so we don't see any good results yet, but, they say someday it's going to happen. And let me just throw this in really quick. Speaking as someone who didn't know how to identify plants prior to this entire project, how many citizens are going to be able to look out over the habitat and know whether or not the program was a success or not in the first place? And that's out of the basically non-existent percentage of people who 3 years later are going to turn to their friend and say, hey, remember when they grazed goats here? I wonder if that worked. For that matter, how many people, after reading an article promoting the benefits of urban grazing, will take it on themselves to go look up some papers confirming that these benefits are long-term, or call that journalist up 2 years later to see if they went back out to the site of question to confirm the long-term benefits? It was the physical changes taking place in the areas I frequented that inspired me to do this in the first place. I wasn't walking around thinking, maybe I should pick on goat grazing. As someone who is a nature lover and goes out there in it, I'm not just seeing it, I'm experiencing it. And I can tell you that over a 3-year period of time, it not only didn't get better, it got exponentially worse. And this is someone who's going out there because I like to jog off trail and enjoy the trees and enjoy the creek. And the areas became impassable. Not only was there an increase in the invasive plants, but I was seeing invasive plants that I hadn't seen there previously. Look, I'm not making this video because I hate goats. I want the program to work. Well, I want invasive plants to go away at least. I'm making this video because current methods are making things worse. And believe me, as someone who is a barefoot runner, you notice when there is a blanket of goat shit. And I mean a blanket of goat shit for as far as you can see. Not to mention, all the nasty thorny seeds of the invasive plants are still there. So between shit and thorns in my feet, I would say that things aren't working. When I moved here 2 years ago, I used to jog through here with my dog, barefoot. I don't know what the plants were back then because I wasn't thinking about things back then. But now that I've become aware of it and I've seen the goat grazing come through, I can tell you that whatever it was back then, it's not this now, because I would never barefoot jog on this stuff. Not to mention these goats, and we're talking about a shitload of them, not a handful, just came through and basically stole anything that was desirable to eat from the native animals. But we'll get to that later. This flows nicely into another basic flaw under the category of how does it work or not work. How do you think that plants distribute their seeds in nature? How do you think they propagate their own species and continue? By being eaten, by having their seeds eaten, which are passed by the animals that grazed on them through their guts and distributed in their fecal matter, or they're caught in their fur, in their coats, or in their hooves. Do you think that that somehow magically doesn't happen with goats? So after these goats just came through and trampled and ate the native plants and some of the invasive plants, they just redistributed the seeds. Now that the ground has been disturbed, the habitat favors the invasive plants over the native plants. And we'll get to that scientifically a little bit later. So someone out there is saying, well, if the goats aren't working, then we got to go back to mowing. Mowing will take care of the invasive plants. Unfortunately, we, the most intelligent species, don't seem to understand that we need to take the invasive plants and their seeds with us after the mowing. I see this time and time and time again. And they come through, they chop it down. The worst is when they use their weed whackers and they're just out there all day and they shorten the plant. The plants don't go away, they lay on the ground. So not only is the fire fuel still there, but the seeds are on the ground and there's basically compost there to help the germination. And the next thing you know, the plants have sprung back up and they've got to come through and mow again. It's this endless cycle of wasting resources, city resources, taxpayer resources, polluting the air, chopping shit down, and never getting rid of it. Look, if it was a little bit, like a couple of stalks here and there, I wouldn't be saying this. I'm not looking for an unnecessary fight. This is a major problem. I'm talking about most of the plant and all of the seeds still on the ground. And again, I'll throw in quickly, this is just the hippie in me. Even though it's invasive plants, it's the only plants that the native animals have left. So when we go through and routinely mow it all down, they don't get to use it anymore. It may be nasty, thorny, invasive plants, but it's all they have to work with. Going back underneath our basic categories, we touched on how it works and what it is, but this makes me want to quickly give you a history update about how we got in this situation in the first place. Early European settlers landing on the West Coast brought over their agricultural animals, and those agricultural animals waylaid our sensitive native plants that had not experienced anything so intense, basically nothing like it at all. But compounding the problem is that after the native plants were trampled and eaten, agricultural plants, some of which were intentionally brought here and others that were just caught in the fur of animals, and even other invasive plants that were caught in the fur of animals or accidentally brought over, were then reseeded into the ground right where the native plants had just had their butts kicked. Many authors have described animal agriculture as the single worst thing to happen to the habitat on the West Coast. And the takeover of these plants is undeniable. They are everywhere. So somehow, doing the same thing that got us in this problem in the first place is now also a solution. And that brings us to the biofuel argument. Because the one that is kind of hard to argue against is when people say that the overall biomass was reduced, therefore decreasing the chances of fire getting out of control. If you want to argue on a technicality that biomass was reduced, it's pretty hard to argue against that. But I'm going to anyway. Let's use the example of me sitting at the dinner table and I'm eating and I've got a salad and I take a few bites out of the salad, but then I leave the rest of the salad on the plate. Technically speaking, I reduced the biomass on that plate, even though I left most of it behind. Or let's just say that I'm eating off of a plant and I eat some leaves off of it, but I leave most of the plant behind. Yes, I reduced biomass. Did I reduce the biofuel in a significant manner by reducing that biomass? But not only that, there's another twist, and this is inspired by me remembering in my childhood reading about cowboys using cow pies, basically discs of cow poop out on the plains, as fire fuel. Let's say I never got up from that table and defecated right there where I was eating. Now what's the total biomass in the room? And sure enough, I went out into these fields where there's a never-ending supply of goat poop left behind from this urban grazing, and I gathered some of it up and I brought it home, and sure enough, it burns just fine, especially when coupled with the kindling of all kindling, dried up annual agricultural plants. All right, so let's catch up really quick. So far, what we've covered is that the goats have engaged in preferential grazing, meaning they've eaten the nice stuff and the native plants and unfortunately left large amounts of the undesirable plants behind, which means they didn't even solve the fire fuel problem. They redistributed the seeds of the invasive plants and likely carried them even further than they would have gotten on their own, but they didn't even successfully reduce the biofuel in a significant manner and may have actually left the same amount behind if they pooped it all out. And now we can start talking about fire. It's sad, it's unfortunate, and yet it's very appropriate for me to release this urban grazing video while California once again suffers from terrible wildfires. It's not a matter of if, but when, and how bad it's going to be and how long it lasts. And despite the fact that it happened the year before, it gets worse every year. How is that possible? Well, those of you who have watched any of my videos know that I have tried to encourage you to perceive what you're seeing as you travel through California. I know that you are aware of your surroundings, but do you know what you're actually looking at? As you look at the Golden Hills, do you understand that California wasn't always golden? Do you know what that gold, that fire fuel, that kindling consists of? And with California burning every year and us suffering the way that we do, isn't it worth understanding what that fire fuel, that kindling is? This is going to be a repeating theme throughout the video, but I'm saying it anyway because it is crucially important. It has been a huge wake-up call for me over the last couple of years, learning how bad the invasive plant issue is. Even the green ones and the pretty ones, a lot of them
aren't supposed to be here either. But the ones that really bother me are also the ones that are the most dominant. You just see them everywhere, and they are annual introduced plants. Annual meaning that they die every year and therefore become dry fire fuel. And after doing this the last few years, I can tell you with confidence that if I got out of my car and walked into any of those fields that I'm driving by and showing you in these videos, I will know which invasive plants those are. Far too often in my shots, the only native plants that you will see are the trees and maybe some shrubs. And not even all the trees. So invasive plants is clearly an issue. Fire fuel is definitely an issue. Are the two connected? Absolutely. Restoring native habitat from invasive plants and fighting wildfires are the two main reasons justified for using urban grazing. The problem is when you look at those invasive plants out in the field, no one's talking about why they are here in the first place. How did they get here? And why aren't our current management methods working? Some of you might be saying, look, you're focused on the wrong thing. The forests are what are on fire. The forests are the big problem here. Well, yeah, forests contain a lot of fire fuel. The trees are huge. It's a lot of wood and there's a lot of them. Just like when you have a fire at home and you build a fire in your fireplace, your logs are going to be the greatest source of heat and fire fuel and keep the fire going. But that's not how you started the fire, is it? Let's say the firewood is still outside in your yard, and on the other side of your yard you have a pile of dried up weeds and sticks and stuff. Which one are you worried about catching on fire? Which one are you worried that a random spark of some kind is going to set ablaze? Let's jump to a present day example to address this very point. This was today going out along the side of the creek, viewing a field of invasive plants that burned. What survived? The trees. Take a close look at the bark. Do you think the bark might have come in a little bit handy in the tree's defense of being burned? Do you think that outer layer of protection might just come in handy? Look around, look at the field. Where the fire fuel burned up, even trees that people chopped down remain. Everything you ever needed to know about the importance of bark in tree survival is demonstrated right here. Let me quickly go back to that cute sign that was displayed in the neighborhood that assures people that if they see the goats eating on the trees, that does not harm the trees. Oh, okay, well, stating that is probably effective in pacifying the public. However, I think the trees might disagree. Bark isn't there for no reason, and just one of those reasons is fire. So you can Google and find out the importance of bark to a tree, and I included some screenshots just to prove to you that I Googled it. But Google or no Google, how about just thinking and how about just looking? For example, clearly this bark was advantageous to the tree in the case of these fires. And indeed, I had this suspicion based on common sense, and you look it up online, and bark is extremely important to trees and their survival against fires and other threats. Think about it as your own epidermis, only theirs is thicker. The vital organs and the veins and such are underneath. Of course it's a problem to have the outer layer damaged. In the fight to survive wildfires, bark is crucial to trees. So with that in mind, not only do the goats not reduce biofuel and spread the seeds of the biofuel plants, but they reduce the chances of our trees surviving wildfires. They're bad all the way across the board. Again, I have to go back to this Bay Nature article where the author is so excited to see hundreds of goats grazing in Redwoods Regional Park. Why? Because the person in charge of putting the goats there told the author that it was a good thing. This is an example of a positive being spun in that goats can reach areas that machinery can't necessarily get to. But what it also means is that the goats spread the invasive seeds to areas that they wouldn't have otherwise gotten to. Like redwood forests, I can relate to this personally where I live, because where once the invasive plants were out in the fields or along the heavily used walking paths, now they are all the way down to the very edge of the water at the creek, because the goats were unleashed into these hard to reach places. Now the invasive plants have taken over everything. Hold on a second, rewind that. What the heck are those goats doing down by the creek and in the trees where the only
remaining native plants can be found instead of over in that field that is 100% invasive plants. The sign says that they are there to get rid of those invasive plants. And this example is from Sonoma County, which just so happens to be an agriculture industry dominated county. I wonder if that has anything to do with the promotion of using agriculture animals. The article goes on to state that funding allotted to grazing has increased, now accounting for half the money going to fuel management. And talks about somewhere else how the lack of grazing could have caused fire problems to get worse. Is it not interesting that in a state that is suffering badly any loss of biodiversity, no money is being put into introducing native animals to do the duty of grazing? Instead, all this money is being spent to bring domesticated livestock into a natural setting. Instead of relying on an artificial solution that requires going back repeatedly, we could let nature do its job. But where's the money in that? Let me focus for a moment on one specific location that I documented, the Pinole Valley Hills. Those of you who have followed some of my past work know that I was doing monthly, weekly, actually even daily updates, going out and following the goats around in order to capture in real time what the effects of their presence was on the local habitat. And I know what you're thinking. It sure looks like they're eating the biofuel. I agree, it does look that way. But just wait until you see the final product. For those viewing this from out of state or just unfamiliar with California's weather, we get our rain in the winter, which makes our summers really harsh because we're a drought state. And in addition to the heat and the fire conditions, we don't get rain. So come November, which is when I decided to start officially documenting the damage that I was seeing, still pre-rain season, so the land still looks kind of harsh. It's not pretty and lush and green. So coinciding with the first rains of the season come these goats, which means that the land, in its first chance to start looking green and beautiful, just gets knocked back down on its ass. Everything new and green that's trying to grow is getting eaten immediately by these opportunistic goats. And that's what I would eat too if I was a goat. It's not their fault that humans are putting them there. So we finally start getting our rain in December and January, and the land is still looking beat up because as it tries to start looking lush and green, the goats are there to match it blow for blow. If these goats are so effective at removing unwanted vegetation, please wait until summertime and let them eat that stuff instead of letting them eat the first sprouts of the rainy season that all the wildlife were desperately waiting for. You're not saving anyone from fire during the rainy season. From late November until the end of February and early March, I went out there and was seeing the goats, and then COVID hit. So that ended my documentation because I was no longer heading out there to socialize, and traveling in general was limited. But that was 4 straight months almost of grazing, unrelenting grazing of animals that are known for their eating habits. Most of these programs, the goats come in for a couple of weeks, maybe a month. It's just a quick treatment to get the problem under control, and then they're taken out. Maybe they're reapplied somewhere down the road, but not this continuous, straight feeding on native habitat. So as I said, COVID came and I didn't go back there for quite some time. One day, as I was driving by on Highway 80, I saw goats up in the Pinole Hercules Hills, and I was like, my God, they're still there. August came around and I thought, okay, I've got to pull over and take a look at these hills. Well, it looks like a wasteland, quite frankly. It's really sad. If you look back at my videos earlier in this year, which strangely enough, the goats were unleashed on the land during the rainy season to fight the eventual wildfire season, you could see the trails that these goats were leaving, the scars in the landscape, as I called them. It looked like wounds where they go through constantly to where there's no plant life left, and it's just a trail, and you got these patches of dead and then the sections of green between them. And eventually those patches of dead would get wider and wider and wider until the strip of green was gone that separated those patches, and it just became a really big section of death. I bring this up so that I can talk to you about some of the terminology I learned in the process, because I was also documenting what was happening out at Point Reyes at the same time that I was witnessing what was happening in Pinole and some of these other areas. So I ended up picking up a few scientific papers along the way. What's cool about that is that I could actually apply terms to what I was witnessing with my eyes and realize, oh, okay, this isn't just, something I think I'm seeing. This is a real documented event, a real consequence of urban grazing. As I go through these papers, I see a lot of the usual suspects, a lot of the plants that I have come to hate, the ones that you've seen in my other videos. I'll include some screenshots, and there are links to the papers in the description, but as usual, I am asking you to use common sense, and I'm applying common sense with scientific documentation here, and let me just read a couple of the problems. As I said earlier in the video, a very obvious one, transportation of the weedy seeds, preferential grazing, the creation of patches of bare disturbed soil, destroying microbiotic crusts, creating patches of nitrogen-rich soil, destroying mycorrhizae, and accelerating soil erosion. Transporting the weeds is a self-explanatory one, even if it's not one that might have occurred to you. Of course, the seeds of these invasive plants are being spread through their coats, through their guts, and through their feet, their hooves. Seeds get up crusted in between the toes of the hooves and etc. And one of the first things that I thought of, and I already mentioned it, is the preferential grazing. Yes, these goats might be capable of eating almost anything, but that doesn't mean that they're going to choose the crap before they choose the good. And they don't. The bare disturbed soil was the first thing that I found interesting, or enlightening, I guess I should say instead, because I didn't realize that weeds liked the bare disturbed soil. They have that as an advantage over the native species because of the shape of their seeds and just because they're hardcore survivors, quite frankly. They evolved with these grazing animals over in Europe. They had time to acclimate themselves to such difficult surroundings. They know how to make the most of a situation, so when you have ground that's constantly getting disturbed, or the edges of a road, or areas that are getting trampled, certain types of plants can actually take advantage of that. Now I'm going to skip down to the soil erosion, because they kind of go hand in hand. Where you have these bare patches of soil, sometimes even the weeds don't come back because the trampling or the disturbing of the ground was so extreme that nothing comes back, and then you don't have plant life, you don't have a root system, you don't have ground cover to hold earth in place, and then you just get erosion. And I experienced that firsthand over the years there in Pinole, as over time there were sections that I used to hike through that I could no longer hike through because the ground simply dissolved below my feet. Destroying microbiotic crusts. What does that mean? Well, about the same time, fortunately, I took an actual expert with me out to Point Reyes who showed me different sections of Point Reyes, and we were able to identify different plants that grew in different areas based on how much they were disturbed by grazing animals. These microbiotic soil crusts are actually very important to the survival of native plants. There's this whole network, there's this whole system going on out there that in our disconnected state doesn't even occur to us. These plants work together in a partnership, big and small, like microscopically small. So with that note, I want to talk about the mycorrhizae. It's actually required by most native species as a part of their survival. Once again, it's this unseen, forgotten, unthought of partner of the survival of a beautiful, local, diverse habitat. And then we just unleash non-native, massive grazing animals that smash it all to shit. In addition to destroying that local, beautiful system, these microbiotic soil crusts actually help inhibit the germination of the invasive seeds. So the local plants just got whacked multiple ways by destroying one small thing that we don't even think about. Most of us don't think about. Finally, the creation of these nitrogen-rich patches of soil, which basically is referring to excessive amounts of shit. Wait a minute, why is that bad? You put manure on things in order to make it grow. Sure, but to an extent.
it doesn't mean that it's supposed to be an exclusive shit and plant system. You don't just keep adding shit and hoping that that makes something that kind of work even better. Nature wants a system of balance, different things working together. And when you just put shit, it kills certain things while inviting in things that you didn't want necessarily. All right, so I dropped a couple of the official terms that I found in the papers that I read and combined that with visual evidence of seeing the same thing. And I want to come back to talking about the land erosion and the bare patches of soil, because I got back there this August and it's just sad. You know, it's just where there used to be plant life, whether invasive or native, now it's just gravel. Now it's just sand. You know, the wind kicks up there and it's a sandstorm. There's not life. And this makes me go back to when I was documenting it in real time, and day after day I went out there, and yes, the goats ate a little bit of the plants, but for the most part they left the majority of the plant behind. The plants kind of got knocked over and they were laying flat, but the plants were still there. The biofuel was still there. So an argument against me on that would be, well, you let the goats stay there long enough and eventually they'll eat everything. Well, they got 4 months. And even after 4 months and making the land look like absolute crap, the fire fuel was still there. And now I come back in August and the fire fuel is still there. Except now the fire fuel is combined with these patches of death. And if people want to say, well, that reduced the overall mass of biofuel, if you want to consider that a success, well, there you go. I mean, you point to something that ugly, you point to death, you point to destruction of a habitat and call that a victory. I don't even know what else to say. But hey, at least we don't have to worry as much about those wildfires, right? Because that's all that matters. Oh, my house. Oh, my loved ones. How dare you say that fighting against wildfires is bad? So the modern human solution is to fight death by preemptively getting rid of life. So after I watch these goats decimate this beautiful hillside that I used to enjoy hiking through, I get in my car and I start to drive back up the highway, and what do I see immediately afterward but cows grazing on the hillside, and it's the entire way home. Public land, private land, it just doesn't matter. You see livestock on it. Whether you want to say it's for agricultural purposes, feeding the American people, or to protect the American people from the danger of the wildfires, the bottom line is that the grazing is everywhere. And guess what? The problem is everywhere, and it's not going away. There's a correlation there whether you want to see it or not. I know what you're thinking. That's still not enough. Show us the evidence. Show us the scientific information from the papers. And what about all these articles and publications that say that it does work? So glad you asked. All right, no one is here to read a paper or have a paper read to you verbatim, so I'll just read from this chart included in the paper that talks about the impacts of livestock grazing on invasive non-indigenous plants. And the first one we have is the effects of grazing. Medusa head was abundant on grazed but not ungrazed stands that were high in clay. Cheatgrass, peppergrass, increased to an extreme degree during 50 years of grazing. I'm glad they said that, because one of the arguments used when saying that urban grazing reduces fire fuel and is good is that they fail to follow up in long-term studies and prove that it had long-term success. This shows the exact opposite. Cheatgrass cover and density were extremely low on a relict site, but had up to 11% cover on grazed sites. In undisturbed vegetation, cheatgrass was sparse and the plants dwarfed. After 3 years of light grazing, cheatgrass and tumble mustard invaded areas where cattle congregated. Table 3. Effects of protecting previously grazed communities from livestock grazing. So California, after 4 years of protection, the effect on the plant community, cheatgrass cover was 3 times higher in grazed
versus protected pastures. Once again in California, the next study. After 6 years, cover of native species was significantly higher and the cover of introduced species was significantly lower in protected than grazed coastal prairies. 10 to 15 years, scattered plants and small stands of perennial grasses appeared in annual grassland. Native vegetation recovered while alien species declined in cover. Cheatgrass, pepperweed, and other annual weeds were less frequent in protected than grazed plots. As I stated earlier in the video, you can find plenty of articles online proclaiming the short-term benefits of urban grazing. What they don't follow up on are the long-term benefits.
Here's one of many examples of journalists blindly advocating for this cause without understanding what they're even writing about, and I'm extremely disappointed in Bay Nature for publishing this. But as that article points out, there are so many contracts for goat grazing out that they can't even keep up with the demand. Anyone see the fire problem getting better in California? Anyone seeing our hillsides returning to native habitat? Livestock grazing is increasing. The problem is not shrinking. Ding, ding, ding. Anyone? Anyone? All right, finally, let's get to some of the X factors. But first, what can we do? A couple of viewers said to me, and rightfully so, okay, I get it, it's a big problem, but what do we do? The problem is so big and it's persisted for so long, it seems like there's nothing we can do about it. Well, here's what we can do. We can stop it from getting even further. We can stop the spread of the lies. When you hear your neighbor saying, oh goody, look at the goats, you can tell them it's a bad thing. You can petition with your own city, within your own county. You can try to raise awareness on the issue. But as bad as the problem is, don't we at least want to stop it from getting even worse? They're going to continue to introduce livestock into pristine places as long as these lies are spread, because people are going to hear the lies and think, okay, well, I guess this is the only thing that we can do. Even Yosemite, right on the outskirts of Yosemite, you have cows. So do you think that invasive plants aren't already getting inside? If you want to save what we have left, we must bring this urban grazing to an end now. And then, once the bleeding stops, once the spread of the disease stops, then we can start to try to heal the areas that have already been infected. But to answer the question, the first thing we do is not support the spread of the problem. A huge part of the spread of the problem is people blindly accepting it as a good thing, even though the science doesn't support it. Another way not to support this, and I know a lot of people aren't ready to hear this yet, but just look at what is in common here. Animal agriculture. You have your beef cows, you have your dairy cows, you have your dairy goats, and these are all government subsidized industries. These are all resource intensive industries. These are all native habitat reducing industries. You purchase those products and you support that industry. But as if that wasn't enough, then your tax dollars go toward paying agricultural animals to go and feed on public land. And these agricultural groups and associations are getting state grants to expand their operations. What is the origin of all of these goats that we're seeing out on the hills anyway? Where do they go? Where do they come from? And so I'm going to use this as an opportunity to attack the cliche of the small, local, sustainable family farm at the same time, because I first kind of became aware of this with a little goat cheese farm down in Pescadero that we visited, and they were about to get rid of a batch of babies that were basically a byproduct of their industry, and they had a sign up that says they get rid of 300 baby male goats per season. And this place was small. This place was actually small, and we're talking about 300 every gestation period of the female goats. And where do these go? Well, we'd like to think that they all find a home. Come on, let's be realistic. Some of them are immediately discarded or sent to auction. Some of them, as they said right there at the goat cheese farm, are sold or given to these goat grazing companies. It's just life happily ever after. They go to this grazing farm and they get to go around the world and get trucked to different places spreading invasive plants while eating native food. We're talking about an industry that at its core exploits and enslaves animals for profit. So do you want people to believe that at the end of serving their time as good grazing goats, they get to go off to a nice sanctuary? You think that the people in this industry give a shit about finding a sanctuary for these goats afterwards? These goats are turned into meat. They are sold at auction, slaughtered, or, as I have witnessed personally, are just left behind when they can't keep up anymore. I've come across their carcasses still laying out there. I've witnessed the ones that are unhealthy and old and can't keep up, wheezing and falling behind. It's exploitation, and it's a nasty little circle of animal agriculture. The baby goats at the goat cheese farm, at the small local sustainable family place. We're not even talking large scale. And we're talking about popping out 300 at a time. Getting sent into a never-ending industry, and then those animals get put out into the native habitat and eat what was left of the native habitat. And then we eat those animals too. And seeing the full-grown but dead milk thistle in Pinole reminded me, these things aren't edible. These things are noxious weeds. They are bad for animals, which means your goats are going to walk right past them. Right along the edge of the human walking path, the goats kind of made their own path. And where all of that was disturbed, I started seeing a lot of milk thistle. Milk thistle really sucks to step on when it's young, by the way. And it's not pleasant once it gets big either. So I get back in August, and there's the same milk thistle. It clearly wasn't touched because it was able to reach full size. It died because it's an annual plant, but it's just a great big fire fuel plant now. Look at the onslaught of the yellow star thistle. That just gets worse and worse and worse. And it doesn't look very appetizing, does it? Well, you want to talk about getting into the nitty gritty details of the lies of some of these claims. You look at this one, it talks about how yellow star thistle is digestible if the grazing is applied at a certain time of year. You look at the yellow star thistle and you think, boy, that doesn't look very appealing. And apparently it's not unless the goats are released at a certain time of year, which means that the people in charge would have to have the competence to make that happen. But even if that were to happen, I've seen with my own eyes another problem with it, in that the yellow star thistle doesn't have a season. They don't care what time of year it is. Right next to a dead yellow star thistle is a full-grown healthy yellow star thistle, and right next to that is a baby yellow star thistle, which means it doesn't matter when you unleash the goats. The next generation's right there already growing as the goats eat parts of the current generation, and as I've already spoken about, the goats aren't even getting rid of the current generation. They're just helping the seeds get to the ground faster while leaving the fire fuel behind. Before I leave the topic of noxious plants that the animals don't eat, I have to also mention Himalayan blackberry, which really dominates sections of the creek in multiple locations up north where I live. I like blackberries, but these particular plants aren't supposed to be here, and they are choking out other plants. There's one spot called Dry Creek, which I didn't feature yet in this video, and the goats were unleashed there, as inevitably will happen. And the result was that it looked like a wasteland, but now it smelled like poop. I identified multiple native plants that had been chewed down to the nub. The seeds of the invasive plants were all over the ground and spread right down to the creek water's edge, and the Himalayan blackberries were untouched. Some of you are saying, wait a minute, come on now. Wild animals spread these seeds too. Wild animals poop, wild animals get seeds caught in their fur. Yes, they do. And bringing that up inevitably causes us to examine the difference between how nature works and how some fake system of humans imposing a behavior upon animals works. With that in mind, let me point out some very basic visual differences between livestock grazing and wildlife grazing. As a barefoot runner, hiker, jogger, you notice certain details such as the presence of invasive plants when your feet are being stabbed, or perhaps the presence of a blanket of shit as far as the eye can see.
Think of it this way. When's the last time you went on a nature hike and were just stopped in your tracks by the overwhelming smell of wildlife poop? Or were stopped in your tracks by a barrier of wildlife poop? And once you start to think about little things like that we take for granted, you start to think about how nature works and all these things that just take care of themselves and we didn't even think about it before. All those animals out there, every different species that still exists out there, all their poop combined, you just don't really encounter it. Certainly not on a problematic level. And yet here's this herd of goats and just poop everywhere. Not only that, but the poop doesn't go away. The goat poop, that is. Poop that was in an area that I documented the previous year is in the same spot the next year, which is another sign that this does not belong in nature's cycle. It's clearly not making use of this invasive goat poop. Now, wait a minute. Hold on here. Native animals eat plants and they spread seeds too. Aren't they also bad guys? Well, now we're flirting with the topic of how nature works versus what happens when humans impose their desire upon a habitat. Because yes, of course, animals eat and distribute seeds via their poop and their coats. But we were talking about wild native animals that evolved with those plants and foraged. We're not talking about a relentless feeding extravaganza where the land looks like fucking shit after they've walked through there. We're talking about animals that knew how to coexist. Whether it was intentional or not doesn't matter. What matters is that there was a system that worked. And we just fucked it all up. But coming from this side is this argument to all of us naive people who see a four-legged animal and just think, oh, well, that's a good thing. Isn't that natural? And say, look, we're going to use animals to fight the problem. You're not using just animals, you're using livestock. The very thing that caused the problem in the first place. I mean, it sounds great. If you're telling the public that there's a problem and that it can be solved by allowing animals to do what animals naturally do, then great. You know, instead of bringing in machinery or all this manpower and these cool, interesting animals can get a meal out of it and have some outdoor time while solving a problem, that's fantastic. And that's part of why me telling you that it's all bullshit makes me an asshole. How do I know that it was the goats that created those ridges in the hill? Well, besides the fact that I watched it happen, what else would have done it? The 20 deer that are left alive in the entire county? By the way, I'm sure that hunters and ranchers are saying that there's a plague of deer and we need to kill them. When's the last time you saw a herd of anything that wasn't a cow or a goat or something like that? Unless you drove to Yellowstone. Does it make anyone else sad that the only thing you can see on the side of the road is livestock? What have we done to all the animals that lived here? And in the meantime, the poor native animals. I mean, we've left them with hardly anything in the first place. Hardly any habitat, hardly any open space, and all of that has been converted to these invasive plants that must be hell to live in the first place, but it's all they have, so they try to live in it, and the next thing you know, it's all mowed down. So here you got like a rabbit or something that's built its nest hidden in these weeds, and the next fucking day, it comes home to its babies, and its home is fucking gone. Like, does it even occur to people? Would something like that even occur to you when I'm going by and I look at this rabbit just sitting kind of stunned, this jackrabbit out in the field of freshly chopped down invasive plants? And it's just like, I'm like, what is that rabbit doing? You know, it's kind of weird behavior. And who knows? Maybe it was taking a break. Maybe it was meditating. Or maybe it didn't know what the fuck to think about the fact that its home was just suddenly gone. And invasive plants may not be very pleasant to eat, but we didn't leave many alternatives, did we? Pretty hippie thing to sympathize with a jackrabbit or try and get into the mind of a jackrabbit and wonder what it's going through. But does it even occur to you at all? That's the real point. Does it even occur to
the furthest region of your brain to think about how our actions impact the daily lives of animals that are in an actual struggle to survive. Like, they actually have to engage in life, unlike us sitting inside watching Netflix and having food delivered to us and complaining about putting on masks. And these animals are actually trying to survive in a hell of a planet that we have left them. Does it even occur to you how much we impact their struggle?
But, and let's switch back over to the other main branch for a second and talk about what went wrong. And I would like to point out that when people are reading, if you Google urban grazing and the benefits of urban grazing, or if your newspaper is talking about urban grazing, rarely, if ever, do these particular articles talk about exactly what plants are being fought against and what the origins of those plants are. So if you don't know a lot about the topic or aren't interested in a lot about the topic at a glance, you're just kind of lumping excessive plant life into one big category of being problematic. And it's really popular to talk about the problems of leaves and how you need to rake your leaves and how you need to fireproof your home. And there's just a never-ending onslaught of urban landscaping going around and getting rid of every single last leaf that falls to the ground. The message that this is sending subconsciously, or maybe not even subconsciously, is that trees got it wrong. Nature got it wrong. Too many trees, too many leaves, too much biofuel. That until humans came along to manage things, life on Earth was chaos. Basically, it was just one big ball of fire because all of this life was growing and we weren't here to combat it. Now let that sink in for a little bit. On an ultra basic level, we are claiming nature got it wrong, we got it right. And I suppose that's possible. No, it's not. But let's pretend that it's possible. So we'll at least humor the idea that nature did need some management of some sort provided by humankind.
Now, whenever I explain this stuff to people, or even right now as I'm explaining it to you, I can't help but realize that it kind of sounds like I'm calling our native plants weenies and like they don't even really deserve to survive because they're so sensitive. Well, that's not necessarily true. They just evolved in a habitat that was not exposed to the things that these invasive plants were exposed to. So over in Europe, these plants were evolving in an environment where these grazing animals were, and they're all adapted and ready for that. And over here in California, we had this beautiful climate on the coast, and certain plants had learned how to live with certain native species of grazing animals as well as with other plants. And like I said, you had these microscopic plants and these tiny plants and these underground root systems and all these things that work together to make this beautiful, gorgeous, lush, diverse California. And then we come through with these cows, these livestock from another part of the world, and they just mow it all down, and they leave the seeds of the invasive plants that also came from Europe with them. And our native plants just can't respond. They've never had to respond. How could they possibly be ready to respond? So how can I explain this without it making it sound like our plants just suck? Well, how about the Knights of Europe? They were incredible. They were a force to be reckoned with. And yet, when Genghis Khan came through with his bowmen riding on horseback, they absolutely annihilated the knights. That doesn't mean the knights weren't impressive in themselves, but they had no idea how to fight against this new type of threat. Humans have to step in with an intelligent, focused strategy, as opposed to a bullshit strategy approved by the animal agriculture industry. And maybe you're saying, well, we don't have the resources or time for something silly like that. Well, we had the resources to destroy the land. Why is it that we don't have the resources to restore the land? We have the resources to implement a failing strategy year after year after year instead of just pursuing a correct strategy for a shortened, concentrated amount of time. Sure, urban grazing is easy and convenient. You just unleash some animals and let them do their thing. And mowing, you hire some people, cheap labor, and they go out and mow things down. it's not solving the problem. And as these papers sadly pointed out, range management departments and the Bureau of Land Management aren't even entertaining the idea of not using livestock grazing.